The Exodus is surrounded by controversy on many levels. Even David Rohl suggesting specific evidence of Joseph and the early Israelites' arrival in Egypt is archaeologically controversial because he looks earlier in time than what is conventionally accepted. But at this stage, I didn't care. I was determined to stick with the guidelines of the investigation, looking for a pattern of evidence, wherever it might exist.
Then David Rohl began to tell about the remarkable expansion that happened at Avaris, which fits the next step of the sequence, what the Bible describes as exceedingly great multiplication.
So Joseph dies, and his brothers, and their entire generation. The Israelites are multiplying, and they're fruitful exceedingly until they fill the land.
We see a virgin land with no population at all, and suddenly a small group of Semitic people settle there. A dozen houses or so, about 70 or 100 people all told. And over a period of maybe 3 or 4 generations, it becomes a very large city, and it's one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The city is a city of foreigners in the Egyptian Delta, and it's been allowed by the Egyptian state. At this stage, there are no slaves involved here. We're talking about Semitic peoples coming in, living here, bringing their flocks with them, and surviving in such a way that they become quite rich and wealthy.
We do know that there was a large Semitic-speaking population, probably came in from Syria, Canaan, sometime in the early part of the second millennium BC. Their remains have been found at a number of sites. We have tombs that are clearly those of foreigners, Semites. We can tell this by the pottery, by the kind of weapons. These are not Egyptian-type daggers. They have donkeys in some cases buried with them. This was not an Egyptian practice. We can't say for sure that any of these were Hebrews, but we probably couldn't distinguish a Hebrew from a Canaanite in Egypt, culturally speaking anyway.
Mahoney traveled to Bristol, England, to meet with a scholar who had information about the expansion of these people in the Delta. John Bimson is a professor of Old Testament at Trinity College, Bristol. He specializes in biblical history and its related archaeology. Bimson sees a clear connection between the growth of Semitic sites in the Delta and the biblical account.
How many sites would there have been?
We've got a good many settlements, 20 or more, which would fit the land of Goshen, where the Bible says the Israelites were settled. Many of these have not been fully excavated yet.
That are similar to the Avaris site?
We don't know whether they're as big until people start digging there. The Avaris site, of course, no one knew how big that was until excavation began. So there could be a lot of stuff in the ground waiting to be discovered and to throw a lot more light on this period of Asiatic settlement.
The only time that the archaeology shows massive numbers of Semites living in ancient Egypt is in this earlier period around the Middle Kingdom. This is strikingly different from the New Kingdom and the time of Ramesses, when there is no evidence of this.
The question is, does the Middle Kingdom also contain evidence for the next step of the biblical sequence? Slavery.
Cecil B. DeMille portrayed this slavery in 2 of his famous films, both called The 10 Commandments. Although Hollywood likes to focus on the Israelites moving large blocks of stone, the Bible never mentions this.
A new Pharaoh arises, and he doesn't remember Joseph. He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives, building store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and makes them create bricks out of mud and straw.
It was intriguing to see this type of construction in different parts of Egypt. Were any of these bricks molded by the hands of Israelite slaves? However, Mansour was quick to remind me that these types of mud bricks are present throughout Egypt's history and don't prove any connection to the Israelites. But is there any slavery evidence matching the Bible out of Avaris, the older city beneath Ramesses? David, what does the archaeological record reveal at this location?
We've got a situation of prosperity followed by a lack of prosperity and a shortage of life. We begin to see in the graves of these people Harris lines in the bones, which indicate shortage of food and nutrients. These people suddenly have become impoverished, and they're dying at an age of typically between 32 and 34 years. So how do we explain that? What is the mechanism that we would understand why these people only lived to such a short age? And the obvious answer is slavery.
The description of slavery was so horrible, downhearted. You take a whole people and make from them an inhumane group of men working so hard. They wanted to free themselves.
The Bible then tells us that the more the Hebrews were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread throughout the land of Egypt. Pharaoh gives the order for all the baby boys who are born to be thrown into the river by the Egyptians. It was during this time Moses is born, and in fear for his life, his mother hides him in a basket and floats it among the reeds of the river Nile. But God is watching over baby Moses, and Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe in the Nile. She finds him, adopts him, and names him Moses, which means drawn from the water.
Is there anything in Egyptian archaeology that might reflect this biblical detail, the killing of Hebrew infant boys?
At this particular point, we start to see an increase in the number of infant burials at the site. Now, normally in a typical Middle Bronze Age cemetery, we'll get something like 25% of burials of infants. In this particular case, the figure jumps up to an extraordinary figure.
David directed me to the dig reports from Avaris, where BTEC's team referred to what they called an extremely high mortality rate of newborns. When all the children's graves, age 10 and younger, were identified, it was found that nearly 50% died in the first 3 months of life. Okay, maybe this was just an epidemic that hit the newborns especially hard. But when the graves of those who made it to adulthood were examined, it was seen that there were 60% females to 40% males. The reduction appears to have been in the male side of the population. So could this massive increase in infant burials at Avaris be evidence for the killing of the male Israelite children? It's an intriguing thought, but it made me sad to think of what it could have meant. The murder of thousands of innocent boys.
For generations, the Exodus story has given hope to people around the world in their quest for liberation. Inspired by the freeing of the slaves from the most powerful nation on earth. But were the hopes and dreams of all those people merely based on a myth?
Who would invent a story about our ancestors were slaves? That just, you know, I can see people saying, our ancestors were princes, our ancestors were great merchants, our ancestors were, you know, something wonderful and glorious and noble, but we were slaves? Why? I mean, if you're going to dream up a story, surely you'd come up with a better one than that.
And if none of it happened, how do you explain an Egyptian papyrus with a list of slave names that seem to come right out of the pages of the Bible?
There's one particular document which is quite amazing. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And this actually is a list of domestic servants from one estate.
We have maybe up to 100 people listed as slaves in Egypt. When we look at those names, 70% of them are Semitic names. And you can literally pick up Israelite names in there. Menachem, Issachar, and Asher, the names of 2 of the tribes of Israel. Shiphrah, one of the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus story, a name that appears in this document. These are Hebrew Israelite slaves, and they're in a papyrus from the 13th dynasty, not from the 19th dynasty, not from the time of Ramesses II in the New Kingdom, but from the 13th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom.
What does this mean to you? What does it say?
This is real evidence for the time when the Israelites were in Egypt as slaves. It's when you get a text, suddenly you've got history. Archaeology, you have to interpret. When you have a text, this is something very different.
This slave list is predominantly female, which matches the grave evidence from Avaris.
The fact that they continue to multiply, despite the oppression, despite the slavery, despite the boys being killed, it just shows that there was a divine plan here at work and that this whole event was miraculous.
The thing I'm puzzled by is why so many Egyptologists ignore the Brooklyn Papyrus.
Although everybody recognizes that this list is a list of Semitic slaves, and everybody recognizes that the names appearing in here are also Israelite names, these can't be the Israelites, because it's the wrong time period. The Israelites are much later in history, so these people we're seeing here in this Brooklyn Papyrus cannot be the Israelites.
So that's why they disregard it.
So they put it to one side and say it's another coincidence.
So there appears to be strong evidence matching the multiplication and slavery steps of the biblical sequence. Indication of a rapid expansion of the Semitic population at Avaris, the only time in Egyptian history that there's evidence of Semites dominating a delta like this. These Semites begin free, powerful, and prosperous, but then succumb to impoverishment and malnutrition. There is a sharp rise in the number of infant burials. Near the end of this period comes a list of slaves, many with Hebrew names. And all this occurring 400 years earlier than would be expected with the Ramesses Exodus.
But what if all these finds in the Middle Kingdom are not a coincidence, and the Exodus actually did happen much earlier than the reign of Ramesses? To see if that's the case, I would need to look more closely at the details of the biblical story concerning the next step of the sequence, the judgment of Egypt and the Israelites' deliverance from bondage.
The Bible records that Moses fled to the land of Midian. After 40 years of living as a shepherd, Moses first encountered God.
Moses sees a bush from the distance, and it's on fire, but it's not being consumed. So curious, he approaches to see what's going on, and God says, "Don't come any closer. Remove your shoes, for this place is a holy place." God said, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have also heard their cry. Like a shepherd rescuing his sheep, God commands Moses to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, 'Let my people go so that they may serve me.'" Moses comes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh does not listen, refuses to let the people go, and God sends the first of a series of spectacular plagues against the land of Egypt.
In Exodus chapter 5, the God of Israel says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord? Who is Jehovah? Who is Yahweh that I should listen to him?" And so we have setting up there this contest. Who really is the God to be obeyed? Who is the one in control of things? And in the Egyptian view of things, Pharaoh was the god of the Egyptian state. He was responsible for cosmic order. He was responsible for the proper flow of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the fertility of the fields, and so on. And now we have the God of Israel, the God of creation of the Bible, who's saying, no, wait a minute, that's not what you do. I'm the one who controls all these things. So he begins with the Nile and ends in the 9th plague with the sun. And these two things that Pharaoh is said to control are completely outside of his control.
God protected the children of Israel from these plagues, while the rest of the land was being devastated by them, to where Pharaoh's servants themselves pleaded with him, saying that this was the finger of God and that Egypt was being ruined. But Pharaoh would not relent. He knew that Egypt depended on the work of these foreign slaves.
In Israel, Mahoney also had the privilege to speak with the Prime Minister. Although seen by most as a political figure, Benjamin Netanyahu was also an author and historian, like his father.
Tell me about the effect the Exodus has had upon civilizations in the last 3,000 years.
Moses was the greatest revolutionary of all time. Remember that in antiquity there were grand empires that were based on one principle, and that is slavery. And Moses challenged that twice. He challenged it by taking his people who were slaves in bondage in Egypt and freed them and took them to their promised land. But he also challenged it by providing a code, a moral code for mankind that said that it is not the king or the emperor that decides the law. There's a higher law. And these were absolutely revolutionary ideas.
The text then says that God sent the 10th and final plague to force Pharaoh's hand. The death of the firstborn of man and beast. The Lord told the Israelites that each household was to slaughter a lamb and mark the doorpost with the blood of the lamb. And on that horrible night, death passed over all the homes marked with blood. But in every home that wasn't marked, all the firstborn males died. There was crying and wailing in every Egyptian home because each family had lost someone.
The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, affected everybody. Even Pharaoh's firstborn died that night, and the will of the people, the Egyptians, was completely shattered. The 10th plague broke Pharaoh's defiance of God, and he finally let Moses and the people go. But then Pharaoh changes his mind, pursues the Israelites with his army, and at the sea, God parts the waters so that the Israelites can escape while it destroys the entire Egyptian army.